All right, so now that we've seen pandas, we're getting a little bit more familiar. I wanted to do a really quick video. I'm just showing a little bit of a formatting thing that I like to do when I'm working with pandas data frames, and I'll show you the kind of the motivation for that. So first off, I'm going to be working with that store sales forecasting. So I'm just going to read that data in, and then I'm going to take a look at the head and just the first two rows. All right, so one thing that you should notice, so again, we've got, in this case, I'm only showing two rows. I've got 21 columns, but let's look at these column names. So we've got like ship mode, which is two different words. On the other hand, we've got segment, which is a single word. And we can't see all of the columns here, right? It's saying, hey, I'm hiding some of those. But we've got like subcategory here. We've got a hyphen in there. So we've got, this kind of very readable, of course, if people were working with this in Excel, this very readable format, but it can be a little bit problematic. So just to kind of show you some examples. So if I wanted to grab a column, if I wanted to grab maybe this region column right here, and I can start typing and it will, figure out, hey, you've got this region column, which is great, right? I love tab completion and that works. I can grab that out as a series. Let's think about product name, right? So now if I were to do, let's just delete that. If I were to do data and then do product with a capital P, it correctly figures out that I've got product name there, right? So that works well. And let's just do our subcategory. So let's just say product or data. Let's do sub category. So that works fine. Okay, so at least for tab completion, if we're doing this kind of bracketed access, everything seems to be, working fine. One thing I don't necessarily love though is, we're using mixed case. So I've got to hit the shift key, right? So it's an extra kind of keystroke that I've got to do. So I've got to hold down the shift key. Another place where this can be problematic, and we haven't looked at this, and I don't do this often, but it can be helpful in certain situations, is you can also grab columns just using dot. So if I want to grab that region column, I can just do a dot and grab that column. Now again, I don't necessarily like this way of accessing. I think it's perfectly fine, and if you choose to do that, that's okay. There are some advantages to doing that. Like for example, this is an object column, so now I can hit a dot at the end of it. Should be able to. Let me delete it. I think I've got it out of sync. So if I do data dot region dot, maybe it just takes a second. In this version of Jupyter Lab, it is not necessarily working as well, but I can run a dir on this. And it should, depending on the version of Jupyter Lab that you're running, sometimes that they have a little bit of regressions every now and that tab completion. We could just have access to these methods that are available for string columns, right? Which we're going to talk about in a future video. But if we're trying to grab this column, even if we weren't trying to just have simple access through tab completion, so we can do that for region. That works just fine. Right, but what happens when we try to get product ID? So if I do data dot, well, it finds profit, but it doesn't find product ID. And why is that? Well, it's because it has a space in the column name. So one thing that I personally like to do, and again, you don't have to adopt this. This is just kind of a thing that I find making with columns, especially with the tab completion, a little bit easier, is I like to kind of convert columns to a standard format. In particular, I like to, remove any spaces and then do lowercase. And when I remove spaces, I like to replace those with an underscore. Okay, so let's just take a look at that, at how we could, do that here. And of course, you can, depending on your data, like if they had subcategories like sub space hyphen space category, you might even want to remove those hyphens. So let's look at different ways that we can do that. All right, so I'm just going to clean everything up. All right, so now I've got data, right? And we've seen before that we can access the index and we can access the columns through these attributes. All right, and this thing is actually, this columns, what it returns is actually iterable. So I could say for column in data.columns print call. All right, so I can iterate over that. All right, so let's think about, let's just write using, each one of these things is going to be a string. Let's print column and let's print the type of that. All right, so each one of these are strings, right? So they're column labels. And you'd want to check that. I think you can have integers as column labels, so you might have a more complicated case depending on the data that you're provided. But since all of these are strings, let's just think of what we could do to kind of maybe clean things up. So I could make a list, right? Maybe call it new columns. And for each one of those columns, I could say, well, new column name equals, maybe we'll take that string value and I'll do a dot lower. Okay. So let's just append that to our list. And see what that looks like. All right, so we've got consistent casing now. All right, so what if I wanted to remove those spaces or replace the spaces, I should say. We don't necessarily want to remove them, but we could replace those with underscores. So now what I want to do is take whatever's stored in my new column name and then do a dot replace on it. And I'm going to replace single spaces with underscore. So again, for each one of my columns, I first make it lowercase, store that in new column name. And then here I'm taking whatever is currently in new column name, which is a lowercase value of the original column value, and replacing single spaces with underscores. All right, so now we're getting towards that. Now, again, depending on what you want to do with those hyphens, you could either, and this is going to be really dependent on your data, right? So you could, if I want to replace those hyphens, maybe just remove them. I could do something like, now new column name dot replace, maybe hyphens with nothing. All right, so now we've got subcategory right there. So let's run with this. All right, now one thing that I do want to note is this is quite an extensive loop, and we can very well keep this, and I think I will keep this. Let's just see how we could get this assigned to our data. So I'm going to bring this up right underneath where we're loading our data. All right. But we've created these new columns, but if we look at our data object, it still has the old column names. So how do we assign our new names to the column labels? Well, you can just do that columns attribute and then just say that equals your new columns. And now that you've got that specified, you see that our column names are cleaned up. And now if I wanted to get product, I could do a dot product, and now we get access to product ID, product name, all of those, which originally we couldn't because they had spaces in them. All right. One other thing is, again, this is kind of I think a little bit verbose. So sometimes, I might write code in future videos where you see me do something a little bit more succinct, maybe with a list comprehension. I'm just going to show you what that could look like real quick. So again, I'm going to import pandas, and let's say here's our original code. What I could do is I could say, well, you know what, new column, when I run this, so I'm going to do column.lower. That's going to return a string, and all I'm doing right here in this second line is taking whatever that value is and then putting dot replace on it. And then next line, I'm taking whatever's in that new column name and putting dot replace on it. So I could do that all in one. So I could say, okay, first do lower. That's going to return a string. I know that's returning a string, so I can call dot replace because that's a string method. And then that's going to return a string, so I can just put this dot replace right at the end. That gets rid of those two lines, right? Okay, well, I don't actually need, to do it in over multiple lines. I can make a list comprehension, right? So I can take the thing that I want to store, and this is list comprehensions were covered in the Python fundamentals playlist. So if you're a little bit fuzzy on list comprehensions, you can go back and look. There's a video there. And I can say, well, okay, well, this is the thing I want to go in. Whatever is in the column. I want to do a lowercase, do a replacement, and then another replacement. And I can do that for column or for call in data.columns. All right, so just to show you that's going to be equivalent, I'm going to comment that out, restart the kernel, clear output. We do data. I can make my new columns here. Let's look at that object. That looks right. And then I could do a data.columns equals, and there we go. So what that code could look like is this. Again, restart, clear all output. And now when I look at data, my column names are in the format that I would like them. Or of course, we could do this longer format and then do that data.columns call at the end. All right. I'm going to leave this in here for future videos, but just note that you do have this comprehension method that you could do. They're both equivalent. This is just a little bit more verbose, maybe a little bit more easy to follow for somebody that's a little bit newer. So I am going to just go ahead and expand that guy out to what we originally had, that long verbose option. But again, maybe you would think it's more explicit, but I'm going to leave that piece in there. And that is just a little trick that I like to do to kind of standardize column names. So there we go. And then there's your data. All right. So hopefully you found that helpful. I know that I tend to do that every time I'm working with Pandas or other data frame libraries, just to make sure that everything is nice and in a format that I'm expecting.